seems to me that one of the common threads running through these panel presentations is the right of groups to self-determination, whether it's the Tibetan people or the Kurdish people or the Palestinians. This is a right, I think, that has been recognized internationally, but how to realize this right is a big challenge. It's like an unborn child, and the debate as to whether that child has a life when they are aborted or they don't have a life until they are born. And when you have mechanisms whereby the Security Council is plagued with the political games that they play and cannot help in that regard, then you have, on the other hand, the judicial arm of the UN also cannot accept cases unless they are filed by states. And these struggling groups are not yet states. So what is to be done? Where is the solution? Where is the solution as Europe tries to grapple with the influx of migrants? And in my opinion, they're dealing with the symptoms rather than the disease, the source of the disease. And really, where does the solution lie? And this is happening on our watch, your watch and mine. As we all grapple, I wonder if anyone really has the solution. But I'm going to open the floor now for comments, questions. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we have a good 35 minutes for this before the tea break. We have done very well on this panel. So the floor is open for questions and comments, maybe on this topic or even something that happened in the morning. We have a bit more time. Thuli.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you to the panelists for the very insightful presentations and thought-provoking. I share the concerns that you have raised, both yourself as a panel chairperson and the panel around the need to reform global governance. The question is, in what direction? I would be interested to find out from the panelists what reason has been given by the UN Security Council for not restructuring. We know, and we discussed this in Berlin, that the current structure was based on the composition of the countries that formed the United Nations at the time. So there was a valid reason how the Security Council was structured the way it was structured. Does anybody know what valid reason or reason whatsoever has been given for keeping things as they are, given the fact that you now have Africa with countries that were not free then, that were colonies of other countries, then they're now countries on their own? What valid reason is given for non-representation? I would be interested in that. Why is that important, the reform of the Security Council? Is that the whole question of watching the guardians, as I raised this morning, is now being used as an excuse by some regimes that want to do things with impunity for keeping things the way they are. Because they're saying the UN Security Council, or the UN as a body itself, has legitimacy problems because of the structuring and because of impunity by some nations. And how can that structure oversee human rights violations and other problems in Africa? That's the first question. The second question is my colleague from Turkey, Fayik. The story is quite sad. However, I would like to know, is the request that there should be a separate state for the Kurdish people? And if so, where would that state be? Linked to that, again, going back to all of you, is is it perhaps true that at the international level we only step in favor of social justice when things have gone so bad that the noise is far too much because people are dying and we also affected? And should we not start stepping in early when there's still problems such as you see in Turkey, the Tibetan problem, and other problems in other parts of the world where minorities are grumbling and nobody seems to be taking care of them? And if we are to act, should we always act under these formal structures such as the United Nations, the African Union, the European Commission, or can we act the way it was done during apartheid, where there was a global anti-apartheid movement? And shouldn't we be looking at a global social justice movement? Which global social justice movement could put pressure on the UN? Because for us in South Africa, we think that some of the progress happened not because, but despite the United Nations. And it was because of that informal global anti-apartheid movement that things moved faster than they could have moved in these formal structures. Thank you.
Very good reflections, I would think, on the topic at hand. Apartheid fell in spite of the UN. I'm sure the UN wouldn't agree. They would like to take some credit for the collapse of apartheid. But very, very good questions. Yes, Ogbondo.
Yes, there's a red thread in the discussion in what Fayik just said, that we should be governed by our values, not short-term interest, something that Ali Alali was reflecting on this morning with regard to Afghanistan. And, but I have a feeling that these go so obviously together, our values and short-term interests. When we look at Kurdistan, for instance, now 2-3 months ago, internally displaced people in Kurdistan were 200,000 in the Kurdish, in the southeast of Turkey. Then it was 300,000, now it is 400,000. Now these are the refugees, not next year or in a decade, they are the refugees of tomorrow. So here, our values and the short-term interests when it comes to facing the reception problem, shall we phrase it that way, in Europe, go together. Another point I want to make is this. When we talk about democratic rights, as I understand it, the whole world of national states is against these democratic rights. This is what unites the world, status quo. They're all against respecting democratic rights. Because that is the holiest of all holy, to preserve existing borders. Now the reason why we were ready to recognize, as Össur said, the Baltic states in the early 90s may partly have been through our own experience. We were part of the Danish kingdom. It was criticized when Iceland decided to break loose and establish a republic, not in war or any great animosity between us and the Danes, no. But there were some people who resented the way we did this under Nazi occupation at the time. But we said this is our inherent right, and the world should respect our democratic will. But even when the Baltic states were recognized by us in the beginning, most states were very, very hesitant in doing this. Why? Because it was disturbing this basic principle of the world order. And this, of course, is the problem with Ukraine as well. I mean, nobody is ready to ask what the people in eastern Ukraine want, or Crimea. Why not ask them? Because that is not allowed. The most important, the basic principle is recognizing the integrity of the state. That is the holiest of all holy. Just a point of view.
Very good further thought. You want to?
Mr. Hammarberg wants to.
Yes. Dimitri?
Hammarberg.
What?
Mr. Hammarberg.
Sorry, you're right behind the camera and in my blind spot. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Very many interesting notes were made here. I think one consistent line which came through was the immense importance of consistency in the work for human rights. So we shouldn't have different standards for different countries or different situations. The whole idea with universal human rights is that the standards would apply in an equal manner in all those situations. And we have difficulties to do that in reality. So it's very important to pinpoint on these problems when we are not consistent when it comes to applying the standards. One thing that struck me was that what you actually also brought out was the need for looking at the instrument of mediation. Because the crisis situations we're talking about very often come from failures of mediation. The Palestine-Israel problem is, of course, an illustration of failed mediation. We basically know what the final solution must be, but still we don't get it, because the mechanism that we have set up, the quartet and other attempts, have failed. In Europe, we have 6 areas non-recognized: Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Karabakh, Transnistria, Northern Cyprus. Kosovo is somewhere in between, but probably now a recognized country. All of them have mechanisms set up to try to resolve the problem and to make it possible for the inhabitants in those areas to feel that they are part of the world community, to be living in a recognized country with the possibilities to go to the Council of Europe Court for Human Rights, for instance. It's denied them because we have failed to find a way of resolving issues which are not really that difficult, but there are interests from neighbor countries and great powers in order to continue the status quo. And there is a need for more solidarity. The Kurdish problem is really one. More solidarity from civil society groups in other countries and also from the international organizations. So stand up for the right of people in those areas, because this is undermining the spirit of peace in our world, and it definitely is a breeding ground for terrorism and further conflict between the countries. So we need to think through how the mediation efforts are actually organized and learn from the failures. Failures now probably coming again when it comes to the case of Syria. Kofi Annan and Brahimi, perhaps the most experienced diplomats we have today, they failed in the case of Syria because they didn't really have the backing of the Security Council. Can we accept this? Or shall we now begin to look much more seriously about how we organize mediation and thereby preventing further crisis situations in the world? And I think you illustrated the need for that.
Thank you. I think it was Thuli who said, maybe we're looking in the wrong direction for solutions. We're looking at the UN structures. We are looking at Europe for solution for some of these things. And I personally sometimes wonder why we don't look more towards the Arab world, the Arab League, and these other Arab nations that seem to be completely quiet. I may be wrong, and they may not agree with me, but a lot of what is happening in the Middle East, I think, could use some help from these Arab states. But I also think that sometimes our mistake as the international community is to look to certain powers as the solvers of our problems all the time. And they may not be in a position, for one reason or another, to solve the world's problems. So, especially as Europe now grapples with everything around it and wonders when is the right time to intervene, where is the next crisis, the next fire going to go up, and what shall we do to put that next fire out, and so on and so forth. Again, it is upon us in this meeting to think maybe outside the box, let me say, to shift the paradigm and to consider where else can the solution be. I liked when Thuli said maybe we should be looking to other global efforts. Honestly, the United Nations has let the world down, especially the Security Council. And again, it was Thuli who asked, what reasons have been given for maintaining the status quo? I was told once, as I've told you before, that the status quo is the status quo because it's made up of the 5 most powerful nations, and the other 190, how many countries that form the UN are completely paralyzed. They cannot seem to change the status quo, simply because they don't have the weaponry or they don't have the economies or whatever. These 5 are the most powerful, and unfortunately, they are on opposite sides of the divide, the power divide. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know. But as we continue our food for thought, and I will give the panel a chance to speak in about 5 minutes. I'll take 2 more questions. One, I think, was from Þórdís. I saw your hand sometime. After I've taken your question, I'll take yours, sir. So, your question.
Thank you. Just thanks for a very good comments, both from the panel and the various from the floor. Just a quick comment on the remarks made by Össur Skarphéðinsson. And I just want to echo the voices here, really crediting him for his work on to many other states with respect to self-determination. I think it's absolutely true that nothing is going to change with respect to the veto in the Security Council. I mean, this is the first issue I learned in international law 25 years ago. It seems we are still at exactly the same place, many years later. But at the same time, like I was trying to make the point this morning, at the same time then the smaller states, whether it was Iceland or Costa Rica or Liechtenstein or Botswana, many smaller states have done incredible things playing the rules. If they know the mechanism, they can use the opportunities when they arise. And even the veto states, they have very bad days. We have US with the scandal in Abu Ghraib, then something went through the Security Council. We have the Olympics in these states that some states jumped on, and then something went through the Security Council, and so on and so on. So everyone just has to be on their toes and really play the game. But also, just to call, what can we do else? And just watching the honorable judge at the International Court of Justice chairing this panel. I mean, when the Security Council have frequently failed, like with Palestine, I mean, finally, then what? The General Assembly took some action, and they simply requested advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Very important organ of the UN, very important decision coming with respect to the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestine, coming from ICJ. The same happened with the advisory opinion from ICJ with respect to declaration of independence from Kosovo. I mean, in the previous UN, I mean, this mechanism was used so often, both by the Security Council and the old General Assembly. It has hardly been used in the UN system, and I think it can be used much more. Of course, it's only one tool. It's only the legal perspective. You need the diplomatic, you need the mediation, but it's also a very important tool in my way. Thank you.
I need to apologize. I was priding in pronouncing the first names correctly. That's Þórdís.
Yeah, the goddess of
I beg your pardon. I don't know what I called you. But, General, sir, please.
Thank you very much. So we are, during our discussions, drifted towards world governance, actually, right? I would like to express my personal point of view that it's not realistic to change drastically the governance within UN system working, and within the existing status quo, as Ogmundur said, this institution would move like it is moving. But what to do in a more, how to say it, pragmatic things, like we want to change, which improve, which UN cannot do. And there are more and more debates going on these days about G20. So this is an institution which started relatively recently, and surprisingly it shows some interesting development. And the feelings in the forums which I attending, that we can think of putting more efforts to improve G20 operations. It's moving from the general issues of debates into the practical terms. In that respect, I would like to refer to the subject where I am most experienced, which is international financial system, reform of International Monetary Fund, where G20 playing quite significant role, contrary maybe to the reforms of other financial institutions like World Bank or Asian Development Bank. So now a lot of debates going on around about can G20 play the role of world government, world governance principles, new world governance principles could be debates around G20. And then there are a lot of things going on. For instance, okay, the 20, there's another 180 plus country around the world. How to move? In IMF, which is not bad institutions, we have system of constituencies, which is not ideal, but somehow it's working. And indeed, on those constituencies, decisions are made on consensus basis. And I'm also from a smaller country. I want to be part of decision-making process on fair debates in a reasonable group, not with 100 countries, where we could delegate or make rotation of representation in this format. So it's an extremely interesting subject which we're discussing, and we have to continue to discuss it. And my point is that UN might not be institution which will be able to revise. Let them play the role which they played before and how they proceed. Like Marshall Plan institution converted itself to the OECD, and it's doing its own work without kind of complete remaking or whatever. So might be that UN could play its own role, but we have to debate what other world governance institutions can be established. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very good, I think, a good suggestion. I'm going to take one last comment from Akash.
Thank you. I will be brief. It strikes me that for all the panelists, one common thread running through your views is the analysis that in the international system, powerful institutions are not democratic, and democratic institutions are not powerful. If it is prohibitively difficult to democratize the United Nations, would it be possible to instead empower other democratic institutions? And it strikes me that an example would be during the debate in the United Nations over Russia's invasion of Crimea, Russia was able to use its veto in the Security Council to prevent any sanctions being taken against it. however, that had no purchase within the European Union, which separately decided to impose sanctions upon Russia. Might one way of introducing, instead of introducing democracy to power, a way of introducing power to democracy might be to strengthen other such hemispheric groups like the African Union, the Arab League, and the Organization of American States?
I want to ask the members of the panel to give some lasting thoughts and maybe reactions to the comments given, starting with you, Össur.
Well, within the comments that Thuli made at the start of this debate, there was ingrained a question that really matters a lot, at least to me. I could rephrase the question as following: what are the reasons the permanent members give for not being willing to reform and change the Security Council? Well, Madam Speaker really gave the answer in her slight admonition to my speech or remarks earlier. What did she say? Well, the planets would stop moving, the skies would fall apart. That is the view of so many. And for example, I mean, it will be very, very difficult to radically change. But that was what I postulated. I said it was my desire because, you know, I'm a fan of Elvis Presley, and he said, if you don't have a dream, you'll never have a dream come true. I have a dream about the Security Council, but I know I won't live long enough to see it happen. So we take the slight approach, the soft approach, the one that was proposed by Amnesty International first, I think, 10 years ago, but they've really argued very well for it. So I do not quite accept what Þórdís said, and the last commentator, which I thought was that it was impossible really to change it. It is the gradual approach. And right now, we have 72 nations that have subscribed to the proposal that France has made. So, I mean, let's go down that path. That is my view. I think there is a possibility now. If you take the Security Council apart, I could count so many failings of the United Nations, but despite everything, I think that finally there is a will within the ranks of the UN to reform, and what I really feel is that we need now a strong, reform-minded and motivated leader that is a cloud based on a solid record. You know, if I would dream of someone, it would be someone that is shaped like Angela Merkel. Perhaps Helen Clark will do. But we need a person like that makes it her or his first priority to reform. And it is possible. And then I'm talking about the rest, not the Security Council, but it is not impossible. You know, I'm a born optimist. And I've been in 2 governments with Ögmundur, our good friend, and I've learned from him that sometimes you have to take extreme positions to move the debate. That is why I take a very extreme position on this, even though, apart from being a born optimist, I'm also a pragmatist.
Yeah. Now I insist on my suggestion that the Security Council of the United Nations should be reformed. All United Nations system should be reformed, because the most powerful states in the world are the permanent members of the Security Council, and I can say that they are responsible for most of the human rights violations in the world because of their decisions, and when they take the decisions, they take these decisions according to their own interests, and they are deciding on external interventions in some parts of the world. We do not know what is the criteria of the external interventions. For example, can we say that the Saudi Arabia is more democratic than Libya? Can we say that Qatar is more democratic than Syria? What are the reasons of external, what are the criteria of external interventions? And we, after the external military interventions, we see that there are a lot of human rights violations and many other problems emerging from these interventions. So this, I think, the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations should be made. The other question about independent Kurdistan, friends asked me. As I said, there are more than 40 million Kurdish people living in Middle East, and they have been divided into 4 big countries. Half of the Kurdish people are living in Turkey. Half of Kurdistan now has been occupied by Turkey. And Turkey is a member of NATO, member of the Council of Europe, member of the European OSCE, candidate for the European Union. The other biggest part is occupied by Iran. You know, Iran is one of the strongest countries in the region. The other part is occupied by Iraq and the other by Syria, and there are about 35 Arab states behind them if it comes to the division of the country. So even the Kurdish people have the right, as all other nations, to have their own independent state. Of course, some Kurdish people are dreaming about it and they are struggling for it. But the biggest Kurdish movement now is struggling for more decentralization of the systems in the region, decentralization of the states, and more democratic rights for the Kurdish people. Democracy in the region and autonomy status. For example, in Iraq, now there is a federal system. In Syria, there can be a federal system or more autonomy status for the Kurdish people. In Turkey, can be the same. In Iran. So now the most powerful Kurdish movement is searching for more democratic rights, equal with the other peoples in the region for the Kurdish people. Thank you.
Yes, sorry, I'll try and be brief. Hubert Védrine, the former French Foreign Secretary, actually came to see my colleague Hilary Benn in the House of Commons recently with his reform plan for the UN. And I can tell you that I believe my party, the Labour Party, certainly buys into the French plan. It seems to me, Össur, to be the only plan that's on the table that stands any chance of success. I don't know whether you agree with that or not. But it's always a pleasure to listen to Össur, or should I say Össur Martin Luther King, I have a dream. And I agree with you, actually, Össur, about Helen Clark, because I have the privilege of having met her a few times, and I think she'd be a very good candidate. And isn't it time we had a woman at the head of the United Nations? But let me just be controversial for a minute. For all its failings, the UN actually is all we've got. To paraphrase Winston Churchill in a way, it's not the best institution, but it's the only one going. And we do need to reform it, that's very true. But let's not forget some of the successes as well as some of the failures. Now, why, your central question, which we've all tried to tackle, is why will the Security Council not consider any change, any updating? And it's because of the vested interests. I think we've all made that clear. Why would 5 nations, including China and Russia and the United States, I think the UK and France are relatively minor by comparison, why would they give up that dominance they have of the world's foremost body, really? It's the only United Nations we have there. So I think that's your answer. It's something I think Umunda touched upon, and that is that the world is united by its preservation of the status quo. I wrote it down as he said it. And we look very much to short-term interests, but I think people who've got that power are going to give it up only very unwillingly if they're forced to. And your other question, I think, at the beginning was, why do we only step in and try and uphold social justice when things are so bad? Well, I think we've got to look to within ourselves for the answer to that. It is part of human nature. We are not good at looking forward and thinking to ourselves, where potentially might things go really wrong, and how can we stop them before they get so bad that lives are at risk and indeed lives are lost. We're very bad at doing that. So preventative measures are something we're not good at. We need to improve, otherwise innocent lives will continue to be lost, and it's the deepest tragedy there is. On the Kurdish state, there's not much more I can add to the expert, except for one thing. I don't know if you'd agree with this, actually, but I had a vision of, so I'm not being Össur again here, but I had a vision of what a Kurdistan might look like when I visited Erbil and saw the Kurdistan, northern Iraq, in small letters underneath, outside its parliament, and saw in Erbil and Sulaymaniyah and other towns in northern Iraq effectively a functioning state. And you will know, small as it is, 6 million Kurds in northern Iraq, that you need a visa to get from Baghdad into Erbil. So if you're not a Kurdish, if you're not ethnically Kurdish, you actually have to have a visa. So it's almost like a separate state, even though it's still part of the state of Iraq. But why are we so scared of new state structures? What is it that was set in stone so effectively by great colonial powers that had only imperial and self-interest, imperial interest and self-interest at heart, that set those boundaries and borders, that we now can't alter them to suit the peoples of today, and of course the desires today of people to have their own self-determination. And finally, if I may, Thomas talked about the importance of consistency, and I was reminded when you talked about mediation, Thomas, that is it Martti Ahtisaari, the former president of Finland, who did so much work on how you can mediate, not only in conflict, to bring about an end to that conflict, but mediate in disputes. And you're absolutely right about Israel and Palestine. We all know what the final picture looks like, but nobody's willing to go there. And I think it's a bit harsh to blame the UN for that failure. I do stand up for the UN there, because in the end it's got to be down to the ability to mediate. I don't know if Martti Ahtisaari himself has tried to mediate in that conflict. So many have failed. Maybe it's time for him to have a go. And just final point on Akash, empowering other democratic institutions like the AU, the Organization of African States, the Arab League, very, very good idea. It's about time. Juma, you mentioned the G20, New World Government Institutions. Yes, we need to be creative here. It's about time we're able to do that. Let's not sideline the UN. Let's try and reform it as best we possibly can. I'm a pragmatist with Össur here.
And before we conclude, I don't want to lose sight of those poor, defenseless people. Xavier, you have to say something of lasting impact on our minds.
Thank you, Justice Sebutinde. Just few remarks. I have no question about my my presentation, so I assume that everything was clear. Thank you. It's a joke. I would like to react about the Security Council structure and the UN structure. This was 70 years ago. And in the meantime, how many states became fully independent and are powerful now? South Africa, not fully independent, but totally another state and very powerful. Nigeria, it's an example. And all the African states, they have their voice inside the UN, and they are part of the world system. So another example, taking the rule, the Rome Statute, behind a state, you always have an individual taking a decision. So ICC is not prosecuting a state, but individual. If we apply that to the UN security system, we have to consider that for Libya, no veto in UN Security Council only because UK and France wanted absolutely to intervene in Libya, And there was some interest behind because Libya has the best petrol of the world. It doesn't need to work on it, the Brit petrol. This is the first example. Darfur, Sudan. ICC was able to intervene there through a referral of the Security Council only because Chinese, they have their reserve of gas, petrol in Darfur, Sudan, but they were expecting to demonstrate that with the Olympic Games coming, they didn't want to have any boycott. So, no veto. Last example, Syria. Can you say that people killed in Syria are less important than people killed in Libya? Don't you think that there is a responsibility of Vladimir Putin with his veto and providing a UN Security Council to intervene in Syria? Who is responsible? Not only Putin, but all states silent. And why not the UN the UN Secretary General? So my proposal is that the civil society and state should start requesting behind the state or international decision the personal responsibility of people who are behind, and to seek for their personal, individual responsibility for the consequences. Who is responsible today for the all people still being killed in Syria? Officially, nobody. I know who. This is our responsibility.
I think this is a very good note on which to end and to thank the panelists. A hand for everybody on the panel.